We are an integral team of professionals searching for innovative solutions. We are Richards, Cardinal, Tutzer, Zavala, and Sefer. This is Legalmente, our legal news podcast. In today's episode, Juan Pablo Cardinal, one of our partners, will have a chat with Andrew Shoyer, co-leader of the Global Arbitration, Trade and Advocacy practice at Sidley Austin, to talk about how the Biden administration will change international trade in general, and particularly in Latin America.
Good morning, everybody. We have the privilege of having today with us Andrew Shoyer. Andy, a longtime friend of many of the members of the law firm, is the co-lead of the Global Arbitration, Trade and Advocacy practice of the global law firm Sidley Austin. Based in Washington, D.C., Andy is a true international trade expert, having worked on private practice for many years now, but also in the public positions like the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative before the World Trade Organization. Andy, as the U.S. will change government next January, we want to profit of your expertise to better understand what changes, if any, new direction, etc., we should expect in the international trade arena with the new administration.
Of course, first of all, thank you, Juan Pablo, for this invitation to speak with you, and it reflects our long time engagement and friendship. So a few points. I suppose in general, I think we should expect less drama but not significant changes in substance. Perhaps more a change of tone. Certainly, the Trump administration has been using international trade instruments, U.S. law. They have also rejected multilateralism almost in an unpredictable way. And I think the Biden administration, we should expect that international trade policy, the use of international trade laws, should be much less dramatic. However, as I say, I'm not sure that it will translate into significant changes on the ground. The irony here is that the populist approach that Mr. Trump has taken over the last 4 years, attacking China with the use of trade instruments, the imposition of significant import restrictions on steel and aluminum, the renegotiation of our agreement with Mexico and Canada, these are largely Democratic Party policies from the last 25, 30 years. So the irony is that Mr. Trump, as a Republican, essentially co-opted, he embraced these policies that had all been associated in our lifetimes with the Democratic Party, which is much more oriented to the viewpoints of our labor unions and environmentalists. And so that will be the challenge going forward for the Biden administration. Mr. Biden has already indicated that international trade will not be the main priority. After all, he comes into office facing the double crisis of the coronavirus pandemic and the impact on the U.S. economy. And interestingly, he and his leaders, the leaders in Congress, as well as those that he will bring into his administration, they are unlikely to see international trade as a significant way for the United States to dig out of both. We are not Germany. We don't export our way out of economic crises. And so it's unlikely that he will embrace international trade for this reason. In that light, I think we have to expect that Mr. Biden will not see international trade policy as the main focus of his administration. Now, as often happens, when you're an American president, you don't always get to pick the agenda. The agenda sometimes decides what is important. And he will have a number of open issues that he will have to react to quickly. And I know we'll talk about some of those, but at least his initiative will not be to take international trade as the most important issues. I think that will be reflected in the fact that we may not see the U.S. trade representative, the replacement to Mr. Lighthizer, quickly. It is unlikely to be seen as a major position in his administration, as it has been in the Trump administration. The other thing that I think we should take into account is he will be reacting to what we have seen as a result of the coronavirus and the spread of the virus. The United States now has a fear of long supply chains, right? Because people now in the US are likely to blame these long, sophisticated supply chains for first the inability to secure personal protection equipment in March and April, when we first started to feel the effects of the coronavirus, and also in the economic crisis that resulted, significant shortages. A lot of people will blame international trade, ironically, for that. They will take the lesson over the last 8 months that it was these long supply chains, the kind of globalism that has set in over the last 25, 30 years, and that was at fault and has caused some of the pain that we have suffered in the United States. And so as a result, I think it's likely, with the Democratic Party now in the White House, that they will not be significant supporters of allowing, or at least to facilitating, global companies to engage in these long supply chains, which has always been really the impact of our pro-globalist, pro-multilateral policies over the last several years. However, I do believe that with the World Trade Organization, the Biden administration is likely to make a change, again, at least in tone, from the Trump administration. I think they will re-engage to allow the selection of a new director general, and I think they will push for the reinstatement of an appellate mechanism, perhaps still insisting on reform. And so I think that will be something that will change as well. I think also that we should expect at least in the first 6 to 9 months, that the Biden administration will reverse the tariffs on Chinese imports into the United States. That was a hallmark of the Trump administration. That has not secured the benefits that Mr. Trump said it would. That is, the United States farmers and other companies have felt the impact negatively of these tariffs, and yet the Trump administration cannot point to any meaningful changes in the practices in China that they were hoping to change. For example, forced technology transfer, the theft of intellectual property, etc. So I think Mr. Biden will make changes, at least in the reduction of tariffs, because those have been unpopular. But he has a very narrow lane in which he can operate, because he will not be comfortable being seen as soft on China. That will be very difficult, because our Congress will continue to push him, and many in the Democratic Party who have been very hostile to China will push him. So he will reverse, I think, only some of the measures that the Trump administration has imposed, but still will need to show that he is moving toward making some meaningful changes in Chinese policy that has been, seen as hostile, and that's going to be very difficult. And finally, I would say that as is often the case for the US in terms of trade policy, what we're likely to see is trade will come up early, but in policy instruments that are not strictly about trade. For example, we know that one of the main focuses of the Biden administration will be to address climate change. That is a major concern for the constituency, younger people here in the United States, and those who supported Biden in the election. So he needs perhaps certainly to re-engage in the Paris Accords, and then to demonstrate some meaningful changes, perhaps with the imposition of a carbon tax. That will immediately raise questions about international trade policy, whether a ton of cement coming from Argentina or a ton of aluminum, will it be affected by a carbon tax in the United States differently, depending on how it was made in Argentina and how carbon intensive it has been. So that, I think, will be the interesting thing, Juan Pablo, is that although the Biden administration might not consider itself focusing early on international trade, many of its international policies that it feels are important, like dealing with climate change, will quickly deal with international trade. So we'll have to watch for that.
Interesting. And a little bit more on how the relationship, always on the trade side, US and LATAM, that you could share with us.
Certainly. And I think one loser from the election is Brazil. As you know, the Brazilian leadership certainly embraced Mr. Trump, and Mr. Trump appeared to embrace the Brazilian president. And so we had heard discussions about a possible trade agreement with Brazil. That would have, so I believe that is much less likely to be a priority in the early days. Of course, given the framework of Mercosur, an agreement with Brazil would be awkward to pursue in a vacuum anyway. It would need to contend with Argentina, and so Argentina would have had to have some role in being engaged in that, at least on the sidelines. But I think that one of the political impacts is that we are unlikely to pursue that again as an early focus. And other than that, interestingly, there really hasn't been an engagement, and I don't believe that there will be, from a trade perspective, a significant interest in the region. The one aspect that I would raise, though, is we already have in place free trade agreements in Central America. We already have in place free trade agreements with Peru and with Colombia. And so the question would be, would the United States react to the challenge of China by kind of doubling down and reinvesting in those existing relationships, encouraging investment so that we see greater use of these free trade agreements as export platforms, and in a sense to fend off China. And if that happens, then I think the entire region would see some benefits from that. But it is unclear. I think nobody in the Biden administration that is being talked about in terms of a USTR or in the transition seems to be focusing on Latin America, again, particularly with respect to international trade. But just to summarize again, I think ironically, we are unlikely to see a trade agreement or trade negotiation with Brazil move particularly quickly, I think, frankly, just because of the politics.
Okay. That's put me to the next question, which is two quick ones. One is, and I think there will be also loser and winners. What do you think will be the relationship with Europe and the UK now that you have been active advising on Brexit? And the last one, what do you think, if any, changes with the USMCA, Mexico and Canada relationships?
Absolutely. So I think that, in a way, one could say that the UK is the loser in the election because of the close affinity between Mr. Johnson and Mr. Trump. At least one can see it in public discourse. No one really knows how they feel about each other privately. So one could argue that it is less likely now that a trade agreement with the UK would move forward. I'm not sure that's true. I think, in a way, the UK will benefit because what I think the Biden administration will want to focus on is Europe. That is the 27 remaining member states. But perhaps more importantly, and I know with many Irish immigrants to Argentina, you have a similar sort of a cultural affinity in the United States, because for 150 years we have seen significant Irish immigrants. There is a strong interest in Irish politics and Irish policy, and for the U.S., if Brexit results for U.S. leadership, there is a strong interest in doing whatever we can in the United States to avoid there being a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, essentially between the UK, the Northern Ireland and the remaining EU. Again, because U.S. politicians were so involved in the Good Friday Agreement, so there is a great significance, both emotionally and politically. As a result, I think the Biden administration will want to engage to be supportive with those negotiations. And I think that might mean that even though the Biden administration politically might not otherwise want to reward the Johnson government, that they would want to get involved here so that they can help smooth the way to a Brexit with trade agreements in place that helps to avoid that hard border. It's again the way that our history and politics work, that holds a very important role. Clearly, with Europe, we have many other issues at stake. The support for large civil aircraft, the so-called Boeing and Airbus dispute has led now to kind of mutual retaliation, very significant. And so it will be interesting to see whether the Biden administration would use negotiations with the EU as a way to try to ultimately to resolve that, or at least to engage in a bilateral agreement. Then finally, with respect to USMCA, certainly I don't expect the Biden administration kind of to reopen USMCA or to renegotiate. We have gone through enough pain and have put our neighbors to enough pain through that process. A lot of it does reflect, for example, higher rules of origin content on autos. Again, a lot of that reflects a very traditional Democratic Party policy. So none of that is inconsistent. I think what you'll see is much more focus on implementation with respect to Mexico, particularly of the labor accord. As you might be aware, for the first time in a trade agreement, we've now negotiated a facility-specific labor dispute settlement mechanism. So if a facility, a particular factory, any facility in Mexico, for example, if there is a failure to grant certain labor rights, the failure to allow for collective bargaining, et cetera, and the United States believes that that is not consistent with Mexican law, they can raise that with Mexico. If the Mexican government doesn't address it, the United States can bring a state-to-state dispute, and if Mexico loses, the United States can impose penalties against that facility. So the facility that has been, so it's completely new. But I think, again, given the politics, we're likely to see significant imposition. With Canada, I think, maybe much less drama. There are still some, lingering concerns. We have this long-standing conflict on dairy products and dairy trade. I think that will continue. But in a way, that because the Trump administration created so much pain for our neighbors in this renegotiation, I think a lot of that has taken, that pain will not be recreated, but I think there will be implementation issues.
Thank you. Well, that's all, Andy, and on behalf of the law firm and myself, I want to thank you to take the time this morning for us. It was crystal clear, and you gave us in a few minutes a panorama of what's going on or what will be the next administration policy. So thank you very much indeed.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Juan Pablo and Andrew, for this interesting conversation. If you want more interviews and legal updates, you can subscribe to our podcast channel and follow us on social media. Find us in LinkedIn as Richards, Cardinal, Tutzer, Zabala, and Sefer, and in Instagram and Twitter as RCT_ABOG ADOS. We will meet in the next episode of Legalmente. Thank you and goodbye.